The silver spoon struck the crystal champagne flute. One sharp, clean note rang out across the formal dining room of the Preston estate, killing the conversation instantly. The clatter of heavy silverware against porcelain stopped. Victoria Preston stood at the head of the long oak table. She wore an ivory silk blouse and a smile that did not extend past her jawline. She gestured gracefully toward the chair directly to my husband's right, the chair I had occupied every Sunday for 3 years. Tonight, Elise Sterling sat there. Elise swirled her Pinot Noir, her posture radiating an unearned, practiced triumph. I was seated at the far end of the room near the kitchen doors, placed exactly where Victoria wanted me, on the fringe, out of focus. Richard Preston leaned forward. The wood of his chair groaned under the shift. He did not bother to lower his voice. He did not need to. In this house, his volume dictated the weather, Ava Richards said. He folded his hands over his untouched plate. Julian is signing the restructuring papers tonight. You are excluded from this deal. Victoria has already had the housekeeper pack your coats. We expect you to leave quietly, without a scene. In exchange for your cooperation, we have arranged a modest severance for your time in our family. A severance package. For a marriage. The remaining guests held their breath. Nate Julian's brother stared intently at his water glass, refusing to look up. Elise offered me a thin, pitying smirk. They all waited for the fracture. They expected tears to well up. They anticipated a shouted defense or a desperate plea directed at my husband, who sat beside Elise with an unreadable, stone-like expression. They wanted the chaotic reaction that would validate the narrative they had spent months building, that I was unhinged, ungrateful, and unfit for the Preston name. I looked at Victoria. I looked at Richard. I took a slow breath and parted my lips to give them my answer. But to understand the answer, you have to understand the 14 months that led to this table. Welcome back to Pana Vengeance. I am Ava. I am 32 years old. If you have ever sat across a table from people who treat your life like a business transaction, you can cancel This Story is for you. Drop your age in the comments and be sure to subscribe. I am a senior corporate auditor. I live in Montecito, California. My entire professional existence is dedicated to dissecting ledgers, tracing hidden liabilities, and exposing the ugly truths powerful people work tirelessly to conceal. 5 years ago, I married Julian Preston. Julian is the heir to a formidable California commercial real estate empire, a man born into a stratosphere of generational wealth that treats outsiders like a pathogen. We married in a private courthouse ceremony, an efficiency his mother considered an unforgivable act of treason. For 3 years, I absorbed Victoria's polite cruelty. I swallowed the slights and the condescension. I operated under the assumption that enduring their elitism was the toll required to love their son. I did not know they were planning a public execution. I did not know they would attempt to fire me from my own life, right in front of the woman they had brought in to replace me. They assumed I would break. They assumed Julian lacked the spine to stop them. They did not realize that while Victoria was busy orchestrating this social ambush, Julian and I had spent 6 months conducting a forensic autopsy of her husband's empire. The campaign against me started with pebbles, not boulders. Victoria Preston was a master of the accidental omission. When the prestigious Santa Barbara Charity Gala rolled around, an event the Prestons sponsored, my name was inexplicably left off the printed program. When family photos were taken on the veranda of their sprawling estate, Victoria would kindly ask me to step out of the frame, just to get one of the original bloodline. I did not react. I come from a working-class family in Fresno. My mother ran a diner, and I paid for my own education. I remember sitting in the back booth of that diner, watching my mother calculate inventory to the penny under a flickering fluorescent bulb. Numbers are the only things that do not lie when rich men speak, she told me. I learned early on that people who weaponize their status are usually terrified of losing it. I let the slights bounce off me. I documented them mentally. I told myself it was just old money snobbery. I did not realize these microaggressions were the foundation of a much larger, coordinated strategy to slowly erase me from Julian's life. They were testing the waters to see what I would tolerate without fighting back. I also kept my professional tools sharp. Early in my career, I used a specific archaic clause in corporate law regarding fiduciary negligence to dismantle a corrupt CEO. I kept that clause in my back pocket, assuming I would never need it for my own family. I was wrong. The first time Victoria Preston made me disappear, it was so smooth, I almost convinced myself it was a mistake. We were at the annual Preston Foundation Gala, a sprawling affair at the Biltmore, awash in silk and polite conversation. Julian and I had been married 6 months. When we arrived at our assigned table, I reached for the glossy, heavy cardstock program resting on my plate. I scanned the list of family sponsors and benefactors. Richard Preston, Victoria Preston, Nathaniel Preston, Julian Preston. There was a blank space where an "and" should have been. My name was missing. I ran my finger over the heavy, textured paper. The absence was loud. It was a perfectly executed slight, designed to remind me that while I might share Julian's bed, I did not share his pedigree. When I pointed it out to Victoria later that evening, her reaction was a masterclass in plausible deniability. "Oh, Ava," she had said, placing a cool hand on my arm, her eyes wide with practiced horror. "The printers. They are simply impossible this time of year. I gave them the finalized list weeks ago. It is just a dreadful oversight. I am so sorry." She did not look sorry. Her smile was tight, her eyes completely devoid of warmth. I nodded and said the right things. I told her not to worry about it. I performed the role of the understanding, unbothered daughter-in-law, because causing a scene over a printing error was exactly what she wanted me to do. It would give her a reason to call me difficult. That was the first pebble. It was small, easy to brush off, easy to excuse. But pebbles accumulate. 3 months later came the summer barbecue at the estate, a catered event with 40 guests mingling around the infinity pool. Victoria had arranged for a photographer to take formal family portraits on the veranda. We all gathered, arranging ourselves in the designated groupings. Julian stood beside me, his arm around my waist. The photographer raised his camera. And then Victoria stepped forward. "Just a moment," she announced to the crowd, her voice carrying effortlessly over the low hum of conversation. The photographer paused. Victoria turned to me, her expression a mask of polite necessity. "Ava, dear, would you mind stepping out for just a quick shot? I really want to get one of just the original bloodline for the archives. You understand." The word bloodline hung in the warm California air. It was not a request. It was an eviction. I felt Julian stiffen beside me. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. But I did not argue. I stepped out of the frame. I stood on the polished stone of the veranda and watched my husband pose with the people who considered my existence an inconvenience. I watched Victoria smile for the camera, her kingdom restored to its proper, unpolluted state. I watched them, and I thought about a diner in Fresno. My mother owned a small diner off Highway 99. It was a narrow, grease-stained place that smelled of old coffee and bleach. She worked 14-hour days managing everything from the grill to the supply orders. I spent my childhood in the back booth doing my homework while she scrubbed the counters. Late at night, after the doors were locked and the open sign was turned off, she would sit at that same booth with a stack of invoices and a calculator. I would watch her punch in the numbers, her face illuminated by the harsh glare of the fluorescent lights. She never complained. She just counted. She was meticulous. She tracked every ounce of flour, every gallon of milk. She knew exactly what it cost to keep the doors open. I remember sitting across from her one night, watching her brow furrow over a discrepancy in a meat delivery. A supplier had tried to overcharge her by $40. She spent 2 hours tracking down the original purchase order to prove it. I asked her why she cared so much about $40. It seemed like such a small amount. She looked at me, her eyes tired but sharp. "Numbers are the only things that do not lie when rich men speak," she told me. Her voice was firm, a lesson meant to stick. When they try to tell you a story about what you owe them, you show them the math. The math never changes its story. I took that lesson with me. It was the foundation of everything I became. I am an auditor. I do not deal in feelings. I deal in ledgers. So when Victoria Preston politely asked me to step out of the photograph, I did not react emotionally. I reacted like my mother's daughter. I started keeping a ledger. I documented the microaggressions mentally. The way she consistently mispronounced the name of my hometown. The way she gifted me etiquette books for my birthday. The way she introduced me to her friends as Julian's wife, with a slight hesitant pause before the word wife. I cataloged every slight. I understood the strategy. These were not random acts of rudeness. They were a coordinated, sustained campaign to erode my confidence, to make me feel small, to see what I would tolerate without fighting back. She was testing the perimeter, looking for a weakness. I let the slights bounce off me. I told myself it was just old money snobbery. I told myself that people who weaponize their status are usually terrified of losing it. I reasoned that Victoria was simply protecting her territory from a perceived threat. But I was also protecting mine. I kept my professional tools sharp. My mind was trained to look for irregularities, to spot the hidden agendas beneath the glossy surface. Early in my career, before I met Julian, I was assigned to audit a mid-sized tech firm in Silicon Valley. The CEO was a charismatic, aggressive man who bullied his board and intimidated his staff. He thought he was untouchable. He assumed his bluster was enough to hide the fact that he was bleeding the company dry to fund his lifestyle. He was wrong. I spent weeks untangling his creative accounting. I traced shell companies and dummy vendors. I found the proof. But proving the theft was not enough. I needed to ensure he could not escape the consequences. I found a specific, archaic clause in corporate law regarding fiduciary negligence. A clause that not only mandated immediate termination for specific breaches of trust, but also held the offender personally liable for the restitution, bypassing the usual corporate protections. I brought that clause to the board along with my audit. I watched the CEO's arrogance evaporate in the span of 30 seconds. I watched him realize that his bluster was useless against a perfectly constructed paper trail. I kept that clause in my back pocket. It was a reminder of what I was capable of, a reminder that no one, no matter how powerful they believe themselves to be, is immune to the truth when it is presented in black and white. I assumed I would never need it for my own family. I assumed my marriage was a safe harbor, separate from the cutthroat world of corporate audits. I was wrong. The Preston family was not a safe harbor. It was a hostile takeover waiting to happen. The tension in our home was mounting. Julian was quiet. He absorbed his parents' behavior with a stoicism that I initially admired. He did not rise to his mother's bait. He did not engage with his father's booming demands. He simply deflected and redirected. But deflection is not protection. Deflection is a temporary measure. It does not solve the problem. It only delays the confrontation. I watched him navigate the Sunday dinners. I watched him tolerate the dismissive comments. I watched him allow his mother to slowly erase me from the family narrative. I began to wonder if he saw it, if he understood what they were doing, or if he too believed that the Preston bloodline was something to be protected at all costs. The silence between us started to feel heavy. It was the silence of two people who know a storm is coming, but refuse to discuss the forecast. We were operating under a truce that was rapidly deteriorating. Victoria was pushing harder. The omissions were becoming more frequent, the slights more pointed. She was no longer just testing the perimeter. She was preparing for a siege. And she was about to introduce the weapon she intended to use to finally breach the walls. The true leverage in the Preston family was never social. Social exclusion was merely the velvet glove. The iron fist underneath was entirely financial. To understand the weapon Victoria and Richard yielded, you have to understand the architecture of Preston Development. The company was a commercial real estate behemoth, holding prime acreage from Santa Barbara down to Orange County. Julian was the architect of its modern success. He spearheaded the acquisitions. He navigated the vicious local zoning boards. He oversaw the construction of their most lucrative commercial tech centers. He generated the actual revenue they currently enjoyed. Yet Richard held 51% of the voting shares. A simple paper majority granted him total authority over the capital. Richard was a booming, red-faced man who viewed money not as a resource, but as a leash. He wielded his equity pointed directly at his son's career. He did not build things, he acquired them. And he expected the things he acquired to remain obedient. I saw the leash snap tight during a Thursday evening dinner at the country club. The dining room smelled of expensive steak and old grievances. Victoria had steered the conversation toward my job at the auditing firm. She swirled her gin and noted how exhausted I looked, suggesting that tracking other people's money was such tedious, gritty labor for a woman. She asked if I had ever considered stepping down to focus on supporting Julian properly. Julian set his fork down on the linen tablecloth. His jaw tightened. He leaned forward and told his mother that my career was non-negotiable. He stated clearly that my intellect was one of the primary reasons he married me, and that he would not tolerate her disrespect. The table temperature plummeted. Victoria looked at Richard. Her eyes issued a silent command. Richard wiped his mouth with a napkin. He did not yell. He simply looked at Julian and casually asked how the permit applications were progressing for the new Wilshire high-rise. Before Julian could answer, Richard mentioned he was reviewing the quarterly budget allocations. He stated that the board might need to freeze the operational funds for the Wilshire site to reallocate capital to older, failing properties. The threat was naked. The Wilshire project was Julian's flagship development. It employed 300 union workers and represented 2 years of relentless planning. If Richard froze the accounts, the contractors would walk. The project would default. Millions of dollars and hundreds of livelihoods would evaporate overnight. Julian looked at his father. He looked at the smug satisfaction settling onto Victoria's face. Then he picked up his fork. He took a bite of his food. He said the Wilshire permits were fine and changed the subject to the upcoming golf tournament. He folded his defense away. He did not speak up for me again that night. I sat there, chewing food that tasted like ash. I felt the sting of betrayal hot and sharp in my chest. The silence stretched between us on the long drive home. The leather seats of his car felt like a cage. Why is he letting them speak to me this way? The question echoed in my mind. It is a terrible thing to watch the man you love fold under pressure. To outside observers, it looked like cowardice. It looked like a husband choosing his inheritance over his wife's dignity. Victoria and Richard certainly saw it that way. They believed their financial grip meant they owned Julian. They mistook his sudden retreat for submission. They thought they had successfully trained him. They had snapped the leash to remind the dog who held the collar. When we got back to our house, I threw my purse onto the kitchen island. I demanded to know why he backed down. I asked him if my dignity was worth less than a construction permit. Julian did not offer hollow excuses. He poured a glass of water and stood by the sink looking exhausted. He explained the 51% rule in cold, clear terms. He told me about the payroll. He talked about the independent contractors depending on Friday checks to feed their own families. He told me that his father would sink a highly profitable project just to win an argument at a dinner table. It was not a family business. It was a hostage situation. Richard was holding innocent people's livelihoods over Julian's head to enforce obedience. If Julian fought back loudly, Richard would execute the hostages. Julian was trapped by his own sense of responsibility to his workers. He swallowed his pride to ensure hundreds of other people could pay their mortgages. I listened to my husband speak. The fatigue in his voice was profound. He was carrying the weight of a corrupted empire on his shoulders. He was trying to protect his employees while enduring the humiliation of his father's tyranny. Victoria and Richard thought his reluctance to yell meant he was weak. They thought money was the only language he understood because it was the only language they spoke. They equated volume with power. They fundamentally misunderstood my husband. Julian was not passive. He was a pragmatist. You do not shout at a man holding a detonator. You keep your hands visible, you speak softly, and you wait for him to look away. I understood the dynamic then. The Prestons were not going to ask me to leave. They were going to squeeze Julian until he had no choice but to push me out himself. They believed that by controlling the purse strings, they could control the marriage. They thought they could starve us out, but their arrogance created a massive blind spot. They assumed I was just a casualty in their war of attrition. They saw a quiet woman from a working-class background and assumed I lacked the vocabulary to fight a corporate battle. They forgot what I do for a living. I audit systems designed to trap people. I dismantle fraudulent structures constructed by arrogant men. I look for the hidden levers. I looked at Julian standing by the sink. I realized we could not win by arguing at the country club. Protesting Victoria's insults would only result in Richard punishing Julian's division. We had to change the math. We had to remove the detonator from Richard's hand. I told Julian that night that I understood. I told him to keep his head down and keep building his projects. I promised him I would handle his mother's social games. We forged a silent pact in our kitchen. We would play the roles they assigned us until we found a way to rewrite the contract. Because Richard and Victoria felt so victorious after the country club dinner, their confidence swelled. They had tested the golden leash and found it held strong. Julian had quieted down. I had stopped pushing back. In their minds, the rebellion was crushed. When people who crave control encounter no resistance, they inevitably escalate. It was not enough for Victoria to make me uncomfortable. It was not enough for Richard to hold the money over Julian's head. A vacant space was opening up in their narrative of our marriage. Nature abhors a vacuum, and Victoria abhorred an unmanaged asset. They decided it was time to present the alternative. They needed to show Julian the superior choice, a candidate who matched their portfolio, a woman who would not need to be managed because she already belonged to their world. The stage was set, the audience was primed, and Victoria was ready to bring her star performer out from behind the curtain. Elise Sterling arrived on a Tuesday. The introduction was framed with the kind of casual, plausible deniability that Victoria excelled at crafting. I returned to the Montecito estate to retrieve a portfolio Julian had left in the home office. As I walked across the marble foyer, I heard laughter spilling from the sunroom. Not polite dinner laughter, a sharp, braying sound that belonged to someone entirely too comfortable in a house that was not hers. I stepped into the doorway. Victoria was seated on the white linen sofa. Across from her sat a woman I had never met. She had the sleek, effortless gloss of someone who had never pumped her own gas. Her blonde hair fell in deliberate waves. Her cashmere sweater cost more than my first car, Ava Victoria said. She did not rise. Her tone was bright and brittle. I am so glad you are here. I want you to meet Elise Sterling. Her father and Richard go back decades. Elise just moved back from London and is looking to consult on some local development projects. I told her Julian's division could certainly use her expertise. Elise offered a smile that did not engage the muscles around her eyes. It is so lovely to finally meet you, she purred. I have heard so much about your background. My background, not my career, not my marriage, my background. The third layer of conflict had officially entered the room. Elise was 29. She was the product of generations of carefully guarded equity and private schools. She was everything Victoria wanted for a daughter-in-law: independently wealthy, fiercely obsessed with optics, and perfectly willing to treat human relationships like corporate mergers. The business consulting guise was transparent. Elise possessed a degree in art history and had spent the last 3 years running a boutique gallery that operated at a loss. She knew nothing about commercial zoning or union labor negotiations. But she knew how to order the right vintage of Bordeaux, and she knew the names of the yacht club board members. In Victoria's eyes, those were the only qualifications required to manage a real estate empire. The Sunday dinners transformed from uncomfortable obligations into active battlegrounds. Victoria ensured Elise was a permanent fixture. The seating arrangements shifted. I was gradually moved further down the long oak table, closer to the kitchen doors. Elise was seated directly to Julian's right. The choreography was relentless. Elise would lean in close when Julian spoke, her hand resting casually on the back of his chair. She laughed loudly at Richard's booming jokes. She poured Julian's wine before he could reach for the bottle himself. She engaged in conversations designed explicitly to exclude me. "Remember that winter in Aspen?" she would ask Julian, her eyes sparkling. "The year the ski lift broke down and we were stuck with nothing but hot cocoa and terrible brandy?" Julian would offer a non-committal nod. Yes, I remember. I had never been to Aspen. My childhood winters consisted of helping my mother patch the drafty windows in our Fresno apartment. I sat at the end of the table cutting my food and listening to them reminisce about a shared history I could never access. Victoria would watch the exchange, her satisfaction practically radiating from her posture. She would sigh, a soft, theatrical sound. "You two just speak the same language," she would say. "It is so rare to find that kind of effortless synergy." It was an audacious, brazen encroachment. They were not simply hinting at their dissatisfaction. They were actively auditioning my replacement right in front of my face. They wanted a reaction. They craved a scene. They needed me to throw a wine glass, to scream across the table, to demand that Elise leave. They wanted me to perform the role of the unstable, low-class girl they always claimed I was. If I lost my temper, I would validate their narrative. I would hand them the justification they needed to finally convince Julian that I was a liability. I refused to give them the satisfaction. I absorbed the slights with a lethal calm. When Elise asked me with feigned innocence if I found auditing to be dreadfully boring work, I did not bristle. I smiled evenly. I told her that finding the discrepancies arrogant people try to hide is actually quite fascinating. I held her gaze until she looked away and reached for her water glass. When Victoria loudly praised Elise's impeccable taste in floral arrangements, suggesting that Elise should handle the centerpieces for the upcoming charity gala, I agreed. I stated that delegating minor tasks is the hallmark of efficient management. I deflected their attacks with polite indifference. I became a mirror, reflecting their cruelty back at them without absorbing it. I refused to bleed for their entertainment, but the performance was exhausting. The lethal calm was a shield, but carrying a shield is heavy work. The tension was bleeding into our home. Julian was adhering to our silent pact. He kept his head down. He deflected Elise's advances with polite professionalism. He treated her like a junior colleague, answering her questions about zoning permits with dry technical jargon that clearly bored her. He did not encourage her. But he did not stop her either. He could not. The 51% rule still hung over his head. Richard had made it clear that Elise's presence was a mandate, not a suggestion. Richard insisted that Elise's family connections were vital for a new acquisition they were pursuing. If Julian barred Elise from the office or the dinner table, Richard would interpret it as insubordination and freeze the operating accounts. Julian was trapped. He was forced to endure the constant presence of a woman auditioning to be his wife, while his actual wife sat across the room watching. The silence in our house grew deeper. It was no longer just the silence of two people avoiding a storm. It was the silence of a trench under heavy bombardment. We were holding the line, but the constant shelling was wearing us down. I watched Julian retreat into his work. He stayed at the office later. He spent his weekends reviewing blueprints and contractor bids. He was trying to outwork the trap his father had built. He believed that if he generated enough revenue, if he made his division indispensable, Richard would eventually loosen the leash. It was a noble strategy, but it was flawed. You cannot outwork a man who views your success as his own property. Richard did not care about the revenue. He cared about the control. I needed to act. The passive defense was no longer sufficient. The audition was escalating. Victoria was beginning to introduce Elise to the broader Montecito social circle, framing her as Julian's indispensable new partner. I needed to find the hidden lever. I needed to understand why Richard was so desperate to force Elise into the company. It was not just about social pedigree. Richard Preston did not care about art history degrees or yacht club memberships unless they served a financial purpose. There was a piece of the puzzle missing, a structural flaw in the Preston empire that I had not yet located. I started paying closer attention to the casual comments dropped during those agonizing Sunday dinners. I listened to the way Richard spoke about the new acquisitions. I noted the specific projects Elise's father was reportedly involved in. I began to build a mental map of the corporate structure. I was no longer just enduring the dinners. I was conducting preliminary reconnaissance. The opportunity arrived on a rainy Thursday. Julian came home looking paler than usual. He tossed his keys onto the counter and rubbed his temples. He looked like a man who had just discovered the foundation of his house was made of sand. He told me the numbers were sluggish. That was the word he used, sluggish. It was a careful, deliberate understatement. Julian did not get rattled by sluggish numbers. He dealt with market fluctuations and supply chain delays every day. Sluggish numbers required a strategic adjustment, not the haunted expression currently residing in his eyes. He pulled a flash drive from his briefcase. He set it on the kitchen island between us. He said he needed my eyes on some routine vendor invoices. He claimed he just wanted a second opinion on some unusual contractor billing. I looked at the flash drive. Then I looked at my husband. He was not asking for a second opinion. He was handing me the keys to the vault. He was asking me to find the bomb he knew was ticking, but could not locate himself. The true nature of the conflict was about to shift from a social skirmish to a corporate war. The red herring was swimming into view, and it was carrying a velvet box. Julian appeared to be a bystander in his own life. During those agonizing Sunday dinners when Victoria praised Elise's impeccable taste or suggested they collaborate on a high-profile project, my husband offered nothing. He just took a slow, deliberate sip of his water. He did not object when Elise poured his wine. He did not flinch when his mother openly insulted my career. He sat there, an immaculate portrait of corporate indifference, while I absorbed the shrapnel. I told myself it was the strategy we had agreed upon. I told myself he was keeping his head down to protect the payroll. But a strategy requires trust, and trust is a fragile architecture when you are under constant fire. The silence was beginning to rot the floorboards of our marriage. The doubt did not arrive all at once. It seeped in through the cracks. I found myself watching him closer. I noticed the late nights at the office. I noticed the way his phone was always placed face down on the kitchen counter. I noticed the tension radiating from his shoulders when he walked through the door. I am an auditor. My profession relies on the assumption that humans are fundamentally flawed and capable of deception. I spend my days looking for the discrepancies between what people say and what the numbers reveal. I had promised Julian I would handle the social games, but the auditor in me was beginning to question the data. The turning point occurred on a Saturday morning. Julian had gone to the gym, leaving his car keys on the entryway table. I needed to run to the pharmacy, and my Honda was blocked in the driveway. I took his keys and slid into the driver's seat of his Range Rover. I adjusted the mirror. I reached into the center console to grab a pair of sunglasses. My fingers brushed against something soft. It was a small, square box wrapped in dark blue velvet, the kind of box that holds a ring. My breath caught in my throat. I pulled it out of the console. It was heavy, substantial. The velvet was flawless. There was no brand name stamped on the outside, only the smooth, unbroken surface of a very expensive secret. For 10 agonizing minutes, I sat in the driveway with the engine off. The California sun beat down on the windshield, but I felt freezing cold. The narrative Victoria had been constructing for months suddenly clicked into a terrifying, logical pattern. Elise was not just an audition. She was the final selection. Julian's silence was not a smokescreen to buy us time. It was the cowardice of a man waiting for the right moment to defect. The late nights at the office were not about reviewing contractor bids. The face-down phone was not about work stress. He was going to leave me. And he had already purchased the hardware to finalize the transition. The pain was not a dull ache. It was a sharp, clinical severing. I felt the fool. I had been sitting at that long oak table deflecting Victoria's insults, protecting a marriage that my husband had already abandoned. I had allowed myself to believe we were partners in a trench, when in reality, I was just the target practice. I did not open the box. I placed it back in the console, exactly where I found it. I drove to the pharmacy. I picked up my prescription. I drove back. I performed the routine of a normal Saturday, but my mind was already drafting the dissolution of my life. When Julian returned from the gym, he walked into the kitchen, his hair damp from the shower. I was sitting at the island, staring at the marble countertop. I did not yell. I did not throw a coffee mug. I utilized the lethal calm that Victoria had spent months training me to perfect. I told him I took his car. I told him I reached into the console for sunglasses. I told him what I found. Julian stopped pouring his water. He set the glass down. He looked at me, his face pale, the exhaustion etched deeply around his eyes. He did not deny it. He did not offer a frantic, desperate excuse. He walked into the entryway, retrieved the velvet box from the car, and brought it back into the kitchen. He set it on the island between us. "Open it," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of defense. I looked at the box. I looked at the man I had promised to love. I braced myself for the final, undeniable proof of my humiliation. I reached out and popped the hinge. It was not a diamond ring. Nestled in the white satin interior was a men's wristwatch, a Patek Philippe, an intricate, staggering piece of horology that retailed for more than my annual salary. It was a masterpiece of gears and gold, ticking quietly in the silence of our kitchen. I stared at the watch. The relief did not wash over me. Confusion replaced the panic. "I don't understand," I said. Julian pulled out a bar stool and sat down heavily. He rubbed his face with both hands, the facade of the stoic corporate air completely crumbling. "My mother left it in the car after the charity gala," he said. "It is from my father." "A gift?" I asked. "A bribe," Julian corrected. He explained the mechanics of the transaction. The watch was a down payment on his compliance. Richard had purchased it under the pretense of a performance bonus, but the unspoken condition was absolute submission to the restructuring contract. The watch was a physical manifestation of the 51% rule. It was a reminder that Richard could buy his son the world as long as his son surrendered his autonomy. Julian looked at the watch with profound disgust. "I tried to return it," he said. He told me to keep it as a reminder of what a cooperative partner receives. He looked up at me, his eyes pleading for the first time in our marriage. "Ava, I am trapped." He confessed the depth of his desperation. He admitted that his silence at the dinners was not cowardice, but terror. He was not abandoning me. He was trying to figure out how to dismantle a bomb while standing on the pressure plate. He told me he suspected massive financial foul play within Preston Development. He had noticed irregularities in the capital allocations for the Wilshire project. He had seen wire transfers authorized by his father that circumvented the standard divisional approvals. He knew Richard was bleeding the company, but he lacked the forensic accounting skills to prove it. If Julian accused his father without airtight evidence, Richard would simply claim Julian was incompetent, fire him from the division, and freeze the accounts anyway. Julian needed proof. He needed a paper trail that could withstand a hostile board review. He needed an auditor. He brought me the sluggish numbers on the flash drive, knowing exactly what I was capable of. He was not asking for a second opinion on a contract or invoice. He was deputizing me. He was making us true partners in the heist. The velvet box was a red herring. It was a diversionary tactic, deployed by Victoria to make me doubt my husband, to fracture the only alliance that threatened her control. She wanted me to find it. She wanted me to panic. We realized then that Julian's silence wasn't a surrender. It was a necessary smokescreen to buy us time. I closed the velvet box. I slid it back across the marble island. "Keep it," I told him. "Wear it to the next dinner. Let them think the bribe worked. Let them think you are bought and paid for." I picked up the flash drive he had given me the night before. I held the encrypted data in my palm. The weight of the impending war settled over us. We were no longer just deflecting insults at a country club. We were preparing to execute a corporate coup. "I need access to the shadow ledger," I told him. "I need the raw, unredacted data." Julian warned me about the internal firewalls. He explained the security protocols protecting the executive server. If I triggered an alert, Richard's IT department would lock down the system and purge the logs before morning. I knew the risks. If I bypassed the security protocols on a corporate server without authorization, I was risking my auditing licenses. I was risking federal charges. I was risking everything I had built since those late nights in the Fresno diner. But I also knew the cost of inaction. If we did not find the proof, Richard would force Julian to sign the restructuring contract. Elise would take my seat permanently, and the empire would continue to consume us. I told Julian to give me the login credentials. I told him to go back to the office and play the compliant son. I told him to let Victoria plan her victory parade. The battle was moving underground. The social skirmish was over. The forensic excavation was about to begin, and the numbers waiting in the dark were about to point in a terrifying direction. There is a stark difference between a sanctioned financial review and a hostile data extraction. When you conduct an audit with the blessing of the board, the company provides you with a bright office, a comfortable chair, and a smiling liaison who hands you organized files. When you conduct an audit to dismantle a corrupt empire from the inside, you operate in the dark. I was about to cross a boundary that could end my career. Bypassing enterprise-level firewalls without explicit authorization is a federal offense. If Richard Preston's internal security team detected an unauthorized breach, the consequences would be swift and devastating. I would lose my certified public accountant license. I would face criminal prosecution. The life I had painstakingly built since my days working night shifts at the highway convenience store would evaporate. I was risking my freedom to save my marriage. Julian gave me his executive login credentials, but we both knew his access was strictly compartmentalized. Richard did not trust anyone, not even his own son, with the overarching financial architecture of Preston Development. Julian could see the localized budgets for his specific projects, but the macro-level data, the corporate treasury accounts, and the executive transfer logs were locked behind a secondary security perimeter. That secondary perimeter housed the shadow ledger. It was a Tuesday night. The house in Montecito was silent, save for the low hum of the central air conditioning. Julian was asleep in the master bedroom, his exhaustion having finally overcome his anxiety. I sat alone at the kitchen island. The only light came from the cold blue glow of my laptop screen. I logged into the company portal using Julian's credentials. The two-factor authentication pinged his phone, which he had left on the counter specifically for this purpose. I entered the code. I was inside the standard dashboard. Now came the perilous part. I needed to bridge the gap between the visible operations and the hidden treasury. I deployed a sequence of diagnostic tools I normally use to test a client's network vulnerabilities. I routed my connection through a series of virtual private networks to mask my location. Every time a loading bar stalled on the screen, my pulse hammered against my ribs. I expected a red security alert to flash. I expected the connection to sever. I searched for the digital breadcrumbs. Arrogant men always leave a trail because they never believe anyone is smart enough to follow them. I scanned the internal directory for unregistered server traffic. I found a discrepancy in the daily data backups. A large volume of encrypted information was being routed to an unlisted server protocol every night at 3 a.m. I targeted that specific protocol. I initiated a decryption sequence I had developed years ago for tracking Medicare fraud. The screen went dark for a terrifying moment. Then the firewall yielded. I was inside the shadow ledger. I did not have time to analyze the information while connected to their network. The longer I stayed in the system, the higher the probability of detection. I initiated a bulk download of 7 years of raw, unredacted transaction data. I routed the files onto a secure external drive. It took 42 minutes. I sat frozen on the kitchen stool for 42 minutes. I listened to the wind rustling the palm fronds outside our windows. I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen, calculating the exact cost of a prison sentence if a late-night IT technician happened to review the active connection logs. The download completed. I severed the connection. I wiped my digital footprint from the access portal. I pulled the external drive from the laptop port and held it in my palm. The metal casing felt warm. I had the keys to the kingdom. For the next 3 weeks, my kitchen island transformed into a war room. I stopped attending Victoria's Sunday dinners. Julian told his mother I was battling a severe migraine. Victoria sent a passive-aggressive text offering to recommend a better physician, implying my illness was an inconvenience to her social calendar. I ignored her. I was actually battling spreadsheets. I stopped dealing in feelings. I started dealing in facts. The raw data was a chaotic labyrinth. Richard employed an army of sophisticated accountants to ensure his surface-level compliance appeared immaculate. I knew looking at the top-line revenue was useless. I had to look at the velocity of the cash flow. I recalled my mother sitting in her Fresno diner, tracing a missing $40 through a stack of meat supplier invoices. Finding a $12 million corporate fraud requires the exact same skill set as finding a $40 diner discrepancy. You just have to follow the math. I started with the Wilshire high-rise, Julian's flagship development. I isolated the vendor payment logs. In commercial real estate, net 90 payment terms are the industry standard. Developers stretch their payables to preserve liquid capital. However, the shadow ledger revealed that Preston Development was paying a specific cluster of subcontractors within 48 hours of invoice receipt. You do not expedite vendor payments unless you are trying to move liquid capital off the balance sheet rapidly. I isolated the expedited vendors: an environmental consulting firm registered in Nevada, a structural steel importer based in Delaware, a commercial landscaping conglomerate utilizing a post office box in the Cayman Islands. I cross-referenced the public business registries. The Nevada consulting firm had no website and no listed employees. The Delaware steel importer shared an address with a registered agent known for creating anonymous shell companies. The Cayman Islands landscaping conglomerate was a ghost. Richard was generating fraudulent invoices from dummy corporations and paying them out of Julian's project budgets with alarming speed. I tallied the expedited payments over an 18-month period. The sum was staggering. $12 million had been drained from Julian's division alone. I stared at the blinking cursor on my screen. My coffee had turned ice cold. A profound confusion washed over me. Richard held a 51% controlling stake in the enterprise. He was legally entitled to the vast majority of the legitimate profit distributions. Why construct a complex criminal labyrinth to steal what you essentially already own? If Richard controls 51%, where is the missing $12 million going? It made zero financial sense to steal from your own right pocket to put money into your left pocket. Unless the left pocket was empty. Unless the legitimate profits generated by Julian were not enough to cover a hidden, catastrophic deficit elsewhere in Richard's portfolio. The realization fundamentally altered the landscape of the war. Richard was not hoarding wealth. He was bleeding. He was using Julian's success to plug a massive financial wound he was desperate to conceal from the market and from his own family. I needed to map the destination of those offshore accounts. I needed to prove that the stolen $12 million was landing in Richard's personal control. I needed the final piece of the forensic puzzle. I accessed the metadata embedded within the expedited wire transfers. Every digital transaction requires an authorization signature. Someone had to press the button to release the capital from the corporate treasury to the shell companies. I expected to see Richard's administrative footprint. I expected to find his personal executive override codes attached to the fraudulent wires. Finding his signature would secure our victory. It would provide the undeniable leverage Julian needed to break the 51% rule and free himself from his father's tyranny. I ran the parsing script. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the dense rows of code as they populated the screen. The authorization logs materialized. I looked at the digital signatures attached to the stolen $12 million. I traced the routing codes. I verified the employee identification numbers. The room suddenly felt devoid of oxygen. A cold, sharp panic seized my lungs. I read the authorization logs a second time, praying I had made a calculation error. I had not. The transfers were not authorized by Richard Preston. The wire frauds, the payments to the shell companies, and the embezzlement of $12 million were all approved, originated, and executed using Julian's secure executive credentials. The numbers pointed in a terrifying direction. The paper trail did not indict my father-in-law. The paper trail indicted my husband. The digital signature on the screen bore my husband's name, Julian Preston. The letters glowed harsh and white against the dark background of the data terminal. I stopped breathing. The quiet hum of the refrigerator in my kitchen seemed to amplify, filling the silence of the house. I could hear the faint rhythmic sound of Julian sleeping in the master bedroom down the hall. A paralyzing sickness flooded my stomach. It was a cold, clinical dread. I am an auditor. I am trained to remove human bias from the equation and look only at the facts. The fact glowing in front of me was that Julian had authorized the transfer of $12 million into offshore shell companies. I sat back on the kitchen stool. I wrapped my arms around my waist. The narrative I had believed the story of the trapped son fighting a tyrannical father began to unravel. Was my husband playing me? I thought about the velvet box in his car console. I thought about the expensive watch and his confession in the kitchen. Had that been a performance? A calculated display of vulnerability designed to enlist my help? If Julian was the architect of this embezzlement, he knew he could not hide the missing funds forever. He needed a scapegoat. He needed someone with access to the system who could inadvertently alter the digital fingerprints. By handing me the sluggish numbers on a flash drive, he had convinced me to bypass the firewalls. If the federal authorities traced the unauthorized access, they would find my IP address. They would find the girl from Fresno, the outsider who never quite fit into the Montecito elite. I thought about my own father. I remembered the Tuesday morning he packed a canvas duffel bag, promised he would be home by dinner, and walked out the front door forever. I learned at 9 years old that the men you love can look you directly in the eye, speak with total sincerity, and lie. My father had left a physical void in our house. Julian was leaving a digital crater. For 10 agonizing minutes, I sat in the dark. I debated closing the laptop. I debated walking into the bedroom, waking the man I married, and demanding the truth. But demanding the truth from a liar only yields a better lie. I am my mother's daughter. I do not panic when the ledger fails to balance. I reconcile the discrepancy. I pulled my chair closer to the island. I placed my fingers on the keyboard. I decided to strip the emotion away and dissect the metadata. Anyone with root access to a corporate network can spoof a login credential. A username and a password merely open the door. I needed to find out who was actually turning the key. I needed the device origin. I bypassed the surface authentication logs and dug into the network handshake protocols. Every device connected to an enterprise server leaves a unique identifier, a MAC address, embedded in the data packets. I isolated the largest cluster of fraudulent transfers, $5 million routed to the Cayman Islands landscaping conglomerate on a specific Thursday in late October. I pulled up my personal calendar on my phone. I scrolled back to October. On that specific Thursday, at the exact minute the $5 million transfer was authorized, Julian and I were on a commercial flight to Seattle for a real estate developers conference. The aircraft did not have satellite internet capability. Julian was asleep in the seat next to me at 30,000 feet. He possessed no physical or digital means to access the Preston Development executive server. The cold dread in my stomach began to recede, replaced by a sharp, focused clarity. My husband was not the thief. I returned to the terminal. I traced the routing nodes associated with that October transfer. The connection had bounced through 2 external proxy servers to mask its location, but the originating hub was static. I ran a diagnostic trace on the originating IP address. The location data resolved on the screen. The signal originated from a hardwired secure terminal located in the penthouse suite of the Preston Development headquarters in downtown Los Angeles. Richard Preston's private office. The architecture of the crime became breathtakingly clear. Richard had cloned his son's security tokens. He was utilizing Julian's digital identity to commit systemic wire fraud. Richard was not merely stealing the profits from the division Julian had built, he was framing him for the theft. If the Internal Revenue Service or the Federal Bureau of Investigation ever audited the firm, the paper trail would lead straight to the sun. Richard was insulating himself from federal prison by serving up his own flesh and blood as the sacrificial lamb. I leaned back in my chair. The sheer scale of the betrayal was difficult to process. A father was systematically destroying his child to preserve his own liberty. I needed to understand the motive. Arrogance alone does not explain this level of risk. Men like Richard Preston do not steal from their own enterprises unless they are desperate. I pivoted my search parameters. I left Julian's division and entered the overarching portfolio of Preston Development. I bypassed the top-line revenue reports and accessed the debt covenants. I pulled the loan origination documents for Richard's legacy commercial properties. The numbers told a story of profound ruin. Richard's shopping centers in Orange County were hemorrhaging anchor tenants. His office parks in San Diego were operating at 40% vacancy rates. To keep the properties afloat, Richard had secured a series of toxic, high-interest mezzanine loans. His debt-to-equity ratio was terminal. The Preston empire was a hollow shell painted gold. The 51% controlling stake Richard wielded like a weapon was entirely worthless because the liabilities he had incurred vastly exceeded his equity. Richard was drowning. The man who banged his fist on the dining room table, the man who threatened to freeze our accounts, the man who allowed his wife to treat me like a disease, was secretly surviving on my husband's labor. He needed the cash flow from Julian's successful tech centers to service the interest on his failing loans. He needed to siphon millions through shell companies just to keep the banks from foreclosing on his entire life. Victoria and Richard were not preserving a pristine bloodline. They were protecting a crime scene. I saved the final routing logs to the external drive. I have the proof. I had the origin points, the forged signatures, and the toxic debt records. I had the lever required to break the golden leash forever. But as I reviewed the amortization schedules on Richard's loans, a new discrepancy emerged. The $12 million he had embezzled over the last 18 months was barely covering the interest payments. The principal balances were coming due. Within 90 days, Richard was facing a balloon payment of $40 million. $12 million was a temporary bandage on a severed artery. Richard needed a massive, immediate injection of untethered capital. He needed a bailout that did not require a bank audit. I thought about the Sunday dinners. I thought about the sudden, aggressive inclusion of a 29-year-old art history major with expensive sweaters and a loud laugh. I thought about Victoria pushing Elise Sterling toward my husband with relentless determination. Elise Sterling was not just a social upgrade. She was not merely a woman who spoke their language or belonged to their yacht club. I pulled up a new search window. I typed in the name of Elise's father, Richard's oldest country club friend. I accessed the public records for the Sterling family investment firm. If Richard was drowning, he would only anchor himself to someone holding a life raft, or someone just as desperate to stay afloat. I needed to look at the Sterling ledgers. The true purpose of the audition was waiting in those files. I did not sleep that night. The glow of the monitor burned my eyes. I printed the files one by one. 40 pages of wire transfer logs, forged digital signatures, and toxic debt covenants. I arranged them on the marble kitchen island. I utilized colored tabs to organize the data. Green designated the legitimate project revenue Julian generated. Red marked the expedited shell company payouts Richard authorized. Blue highlighted the spoofed login credentials framing my husband for the theft. The paper felt heavy in my hands. It was the physical weight of a felony. I needed the final piece of the puzzle. Elise Sterling, the woman auditioning for my chair at the dining table. Victoria paraded her as the ultimate prize, a pedigree wrapped in cashmere. But pedigrees do not pay the interest on failing mezzanine loans. I dug into the Sterling Investment Group. I accessed public filings, securities disclosures, and property tax records. The Sterlings possessed old money, but generational wealth can burn just as fast as the new kind if the market turns and the investments turn sour. I focused on Elise. She ran a boutique art gallery in London. Art galleries are notoriously efficient vehicles for moving capital without raising regulatory eyebrows. Valuations are subjective. A painting is worth whatever an anonymous buyer is willing to pay. I pulled the incorporation documents and the public sales records for her gallery. The business operated at a staggering deficit, yet it routinely acquired and sold overpriced, contemporary pieces from undisclosed international buyers. I traced the origin of those buyers. They utilized holding companies registered to post office boxes in the Cayman Islands. I cross-referenced those specific addresses with my master spreadsheet. They were the exact same Cayman registry addresses Richard used for his phantom landscaping conglomerate. The truth locked into place. It was not a courtship. It was a merger of two drowning syndicates. The Sterlings were overleveraged in European commercial real estate. Richard was suffocating under California debt. Elise was not a wealthy heiress looking for a handsome partner. She was a designated bagman. Her father and Richard were crafting a strategic partnership. They intended to merge their failing portfolios, inflate the combined asset valuations, and secure an immense institutional bailout loan based on fraudulent equity. They would use the clean capital flowing through the art gallery to wash the embezzled funds from Preston Development. But to execute the merger, Richard needed unquestioned control of the company. He needed Julian to sign away his autonomy. And they needed me gone, because an auditor living in the house is a liability they could not afford. Victoria's snobbery was a shield, a loud, distracting, theatrical performance designed to keep everyone looking at my working-class background instead of examining their bank statements. They manufactured a social drama to hide a financial crime. Dawn broke over Montecito. The sky turned a pale, bruised purple. I heard the bedroom door open. Julian walked into the kitchen, rubbing the back of his neck. He stopped when he saw the island. He looked at the 40 pages, the colored tabs, and the blinking cursor on my laptop screen. I did not offer a gentle preamble. You do not soften a diagnosis like this. I slid the binder across the smooth stone surface. I told him to sit down. I told him to look at the blue tabs first. He pulled out a stool. He opened the binder. I watched his eyes scan the routing logs. I watched him trace the digital signatures bearing his own name. I watched the realization hit him that his father was not just stealing his profits. His father was building a federal indictment and placing it squarely on his son's shoulders. Julian did not shout. He did not throw the binder across the room. He exhibited the same chilling stillness I had cultivated. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking like a statue carved from ash. He turned to the red tabs. He read the shell company payouts. He turned to the final section outlining Elise Sterling, the art gallery, and the Cayman Island connections. He closed the binder. The snap of the cardboard rings was the loudest sound in the room. They are using her to launder the bailout, he said. His voice was a hollow rasp. The marriage is just a corporate structuring requirement. Yes, I replied. You are the collateral. The betrayal severed the last remaining thread of his filial loyalty. The man who had endured years of belittling Sunday dinners, the son who had swallowed his pride to protect his construction crews, vanished. In his place sat a corporate executive who had just discovered a hostile entity operating inside his perimeter. We did not shed tears. We did not waste energy on grief. Grief is a luxury for people who are not currently being hunted. We needed a wartime strategist. We needed someone who understood the architecture of corporate ruin and knew how to wield it without flinching. I knew a name, Marcus Thorne, a ruthless litigator based in Los Angeles. Thorne did not negotiate settlements. He orchestrated unconditional surrenders. He specialized in unspooling complex family trusts and burying corrupt patriarchs under mountains of discovery motions. I called his office at 8 in the morning. I secured an emergency consultation. We drove down the coast, the 40-page binder sitting on the center console between us like a loaded weapon. Thorne reviewed the documents in his glass-walled conference room. He wore a sharp, bespoke suit and possessed the cold eyes of a shark. He did not offer sympathetic platitudes. He simply nodded, tapped his expensive pen against the desk, and said we had enough ammunition to level the Preston estate and salt the earth underneath it. Thorne began drafting the counteroffensive. We were going to build an ironclad buyout agreement, a document demanding Richard surrender his controlling 51% stake immediately. In exchange, Julian would agree not to hand the binder to the federal authorities. We were constructing a flawless checkmate. But while we armed ourselves with statutes and forensic proof in a Los Angeles high-rise, Victoria remained oblivious in Montecito. She thought the battlefield was social. She believed she was winning because I had stopped attending her dinners. Ignorant of the legal trap closing around her throat, Victoria decided it was time to accelerate my exit. She needed to prepare the ground for a lease. She began deploying her network. She started whispering to the local elite. The Whisper campaign was launching a desperate attempt to control the narrative before the truth could see the light of day. There is a specific kind of warfare native to affluent zip codes. It does not involve raised voices or slammed doors. It is fought in the produce aisles of high-end organic markets and over the rims of porcelain teacups at charity luncheons. It is a slow, corrosive process designed to isolate the target before the final blow is delivered. While Marcus Thorne drafted the legal instruments of our retaliation in his Los Angeles office, Victoria Preston launched her social offensive in Montecito. Ignorant of the forensic trap closing around her throat, Victoria decided it was time to curate the narrative of my departure. She needed the local elite to view my exit not as a hostile corporate eviction, but as a tragic, inevitable necessity. To accomplish this, she weaponized the most insidious tool in her arsenal: pity. The campaign began with whispers. I encountered the first wave on a Wednesday afternoon. I was standing near the floral display at the local market, inspecting a bunch of eucalyptus. A woman named Beatrice approached me. Beatrice sat on the museum planning committee alongside Victoria. She possessed the kind of manufactured warmth that always signals an impending insult. She placed a manicured hand on my forearm. She tilted her head, her expression painted with exaggerated concern. "Ava, dear," she murmured, "I was so sorry to hear about your recent struggles. Victoria mentioned you have been finding the pressures of your career and the family obligations a bit too heavy lately. Please know we are all praying for you to find some peace." I looked at Beatrice. I looked at the hand resting on my arm. Victoria had not told her I was busy. Victoria had told her I was breaking. The strategy was brilliant in its cruelty. By claiming I was struggling with my mental health, Victoria accomplished two goals simultaneously. First, she invalidated any future complaints I might voice. If I spoke out against the family, society would dismiss my grievances as the paranoid ramblings of an unstable woman. Second, she created a vacuum of competence, a void that a capable, resilient woman like Elise Sterling could graciously fill. I did not yank my arm away from Beatrice. I did not correct her or defend my sanity. I offered a serene, impenetrable smile. I thanked her for her concern, placed the eucalyptus in my basket, and walked away. I absorbed the slight, silently. I understood that arguing with a proxy is a waste of ammunition. Beatrice was merely a messenger pigeon, carrying a toxic note. The pitying looks multiplied. I received text messages from extended family members on Julian's side. The messages contained no specific questions, only vague offers of support and suggestions that I take some time away to rest and recover. The implication was clear. The Preston family was bravely dealing with a defective daughter-in-law. The most potent delivery system for Victoria's narrative was Julian's younger brother, Nathaniel. Nate was a golden boy who wore his unearned inheritance like a personality trait. He spent his Tuesdays on the golf course and his evenings regurgitating his mother's opinions without ever subjecting them to critical thought. He lacked Julian's grit and intellect. Nate preferred the comfortable surface of things, making him the perfect unwitting accomplice for Victoria's machinations. Nate called our house late one Friday evening. Julian put the call on the speakerphone, motioning for me to listen. We sat at the kitchen island, the very spot where we had uncovered the $12 million embezzlement, and listened to Nate deliver his mother's talking points. "Julian, man, I am just calling because Mom is really worried," Nate said. His voice echoed slightly through the digital speaker. "We all are. Ava seems really detached lately. Mom said she is barely holding it together." Julian looked at me. His eyes were dark, unreadable. He asked his brother what he meant. "Look, nobody is blaming her," Nate continued, adopting a tone of magnanimous forgiveness. "Coming from her background, getting dropped into the Preston world, it is a lot of pressure. It is overwhelming. Mom was just saying that maybe someone like Elise is better equipped to handle the foundation duties and the corporate events. Elise understands the landscape. She speaks the language. It might be a relief for Ava to just step away." There it was. The replacement was being formally pitched, wrapped in the guise of sibling concern. Elise was better equipped. Elise understood the landscape. The translation was effortless. Ava is broken. Elise is the upgrade. Julian did not react to the bait. He adhered to the lethal calm we had cultivated. He thanked his brother for the concern, stated that we were managing our affairs privately, and ended the call. We sat in the quiet kitchen. The air felt heavy with the sheer audacity of the manipulation. They were building a paper-thin story built on class prejudice and fabricated illness. It requires a profound level of discipline to sit still while people orchestrate your character assassination. Every instinct demands that you enter the public square and scream the truth. You want to post the evidence online. You want to call the country club wives and explain the intricacies of offshore holding companies. You want to demand justice. But demanding justice from an audience that wants to see you fail is a fool's errand. I relied on my training. When a fraudulent chief financial officer attempts to explain away a missing asset during an audit, you do not interrupt them. You let them talk. You let them construct their elaborate lie. You take meticulous notes. You allow them to build the scaffolding of their own perjury, because every lie they tell adds intent to the crime. I let Victoria build her narrative. I let the rumors circulate. I absorbed the fake sympathy and the patronizing text messages. I became an observer in my own social execution. I knew something they did not. A story spun over tea and golf carts cannot withstand the undeniable weight of a paper trail. Victoria was managing reputations. I was managing felony evidence. Her whisper campaign would mean nothing the moment Marcus Thorne filed the forensic discovery motions. I was content to let her arrange the deck chairs on a sinking ship. But while Victoria waged her war on the social front, Richard was maneuvering on the corporate flank. The social smear was merely the anesthetic, designed to make the amputation painless. The amputation itself was scheduled to happen in Richard's office. He needed the untethered capital from the Sterling family to cover his ballooning debt. He needed to wash the embezzled $12 million. To execute this, he required Julian's signature. The dual assault reached its peak the following Tuesday. Julian received a formal summons to the executive suite at Preston Development headquarters. Richard did not ask his son for a meeting. He demanded his presence. Julian walked into the penthouse office. Richard was seated behind a sprawling mahogany desk. He did not offer a greeting. He slid a thick, leather-bound folder across the polished wood. Richard informed Julian that the company was undergoing a vital structural pivot. He framed it as a necessary evolution for tax efficiency and market expansion. He instructed Julian to review the documents inside the folder. Julian opened the file. It was not a routine strategic proposal. It was a binding legal instrument. The document was titled a restructuring contract. The language within the pages was dense, but the intent was unmistakable. The contract required Julian to formally surrender all autonomous operational control of his highly profitable division. It mandated that all future capital allocations be routed directly through a newly established central steering committee, a committee controlled entirely by Richard. Furthermore, the document contained a specific, alarming clause. It explicitly named the Sterling Investment Group as a primary strategic partner in all upcoming acquisitions, granting Elise's father unprecedented access to the internal cash flow. The contract effectively stripped Julian of his authority, locked me out of any potential marital assets tied to his division, and created the perfect laundering mechanism for the fraudulent equity merger. Julian looked up from the pages. He asked his father what would happen if he declined to sign the agreement. Richard leaned back in his leather chair. The veneer of corporate paternalism vanished. The desperate, cornered man emerged. Richard delivered the ultimate ultimatum. He stated that the document was non-negotiable. He told Julian that if the signature line remained empty by the upcoming Saturday family dinner, the board would freeze the operating accounts for the Wilshire high-rise on Monday morning. The union workers would be locked out. The project would collapse. The ticking clock was set. The boulder was positioned directly over our heads. Richard believed he had engineered the perfect trap. He assumed Julian backed into a corner and, facing the destruction of his flagship project, would sign away his professional life and, by extension, his wife. Julian closed the leather-bound folder. He did not argue. He did not let the panic show. He smiled, a thin, hollow smile, told his father he needed a few days to review the legal terminology, and walked out of the penthouse. He did not go back to his desk. He drove straight to our house, the physical proof of financial malice sitting on the passenger's seat. The social whispers and the corporate threats were converging on a single point in time: Saturday night. Julian tossed the leather portfolio onto our kitchen island. The heavy binding landed with a dull thud against the marble. He loosened his tie, stripped off his suit jacket, and draped it over a bar stool. He looked older than he had that morning. The fatigue pulling at his features was not the result of a long workday. It was the exhaustion of a man who had just looked his own father in the eye and recognized an executioner. I pulled the portfolio toward me. I opened the cover. The document inside spanned 50 pages of dense legal typography. The header declared it a strategic operational realignment. I read the clauses carefully, letting my professional training guide my eyes past the sanitized corporate jargon. It did not take long to find the blade hidden in the text. The contract demanded Julian relinquish his executive voting rights within the Commercial Development Division. It stripped his autonomy, transferring all capital authorization to a newly formed Central Steering Committee. Richard chaired that committee. More revealing was Section 4, subsection B. It formally integrated the Sterling Investment Group as a primary equity partner, granting Elise's father direct oversight of the revenue streams. It was a masterpiece of corporate theft. Richard was legally paving the road to siphon the remaining legitimate funds to cover his toxic loans, using Elise's family as the laundering vehicle. By forcing Julian to sign, Richard insulated himself from any future fiduciary claims. Julian would be voluntarily surrendering his life work. It effectively locked me out of any marital assets tied to his division, leaving me with nothing but a severed connection to a ruined empire. I closed the portfolio. I looked up at my husband. He poured a glass of cold water from the refrigerator dispenser. He drank it slowly. He told me the deadline: Saturday night, the family dinner at the estate. If the signature page remained blank by dessert, Richard would instruct the corporate treasury to freeze the operating accounts for the Wilshire project first thing Monday morning. The site would shut down. 300 union contractors would be turned away at the gates. The default would trigger a cascade of lawsuits that would bury Julian professionally. A profound silence settled over our kitchen. The ticking of the wall clock seemed to magnify, marking the seconds slipping away. We had 72 hours. The pressure was a physical weight in the room. I watched Julian stare out the window into the dark California night. He was facing the ultimate precipice. I knew what he was leaving behind. It is one thing to discover your family is corrupt. It is an entirely different burden to be the instrument of their destruction. The question hovered in the space between us. When the final hour arrived, would he choose the man who raised him, or would he choose the woman sitting across from him? Would he pull the trigger, or would he fold to save the illusion of peace? Julian turned away from the window. He met my gaze. His eyes were devoid of hesitation. He picked up the leather portfolio and tapped it against his palm. "We take this to Thorne tomorrow morning," he said. His voice was steady. It was the voice of a man who had finally finished mourning a father who never truly existed. The drive to Los Angeles the next day felt remarkably short. The coastal highway blurred past the windows. We navigated the dense morning traffic and arrived at Marcus Thorne's high-rise office building. We bypassed the reception area and walked directly into the glass-walled conference room. Thorne sat behind his desk reviewing a legal brief. He looked up, his predatory eyes assessing our posture. Julian placed the restructuring contract on the polished glass surface. He explained the deadline and the threat against the Wilshire accounts. Thorne picked up the document. He produced a silver pen and began reading. He did not rush. He scrutinized every paragraph, marking the margins with sharp, decisive lines. 10 minutes passed in total silence. Thorne set his pen down. He looked at Julian, then at me. A thin, dangerous smile touched the corners of his mouth. He tapped the document. "This is not a contract," he stated. "This is a ransom note, and it is the most spectacular mistake your father could have possibly made." I asked him to explain the mechanism. Thorne leaned forward, resting his elbows on the expansive desk. He detailed how the restructuring document provided the missing link in our forensic chain. The 40-page audit I had compiled proved the embezzlement. The offshore holding companies proved the intent to hide the stolen funds. But this new contract proved coercion. Richard was utilizing his position of power to extort his son, forcing Julian to legitimize a fraudulent merger under the threat of financial ruin. Thorne explained that in the eyes of a federal prosecutor, the contract elevated the corporate dispute into a criminal racketeering enterprise. Richard had handed us the smoking gun. "The defense strategy is irrelevant now," Thorne continued. "We are shifting to a scorched earth offense. We will use this document to secure an immediate, non-negotiable surrender." He outlined the countermeasure. We would draft an ironclad buyout agreement, a legal instrument demanding Richard transfer his 51% controlling stake to Julian effectively immediately. In exchange, Julian would agree to withhold the audit, the wire transfer logs, and the coercion evidence from the federal authorities. It was a flawless checkmate. Richard would have to choose between surrendering his empire or spending the remaining years of his life in a federal penitentiary. We left Thorne's office with a clear directive. We returned to Montecito to endure the final countdown. Thursday bled into Friday. The air in our house felt charged with static electricity. The social pressure Victoria was orchestrating in the background continued to swirl, but it felt distant now, irrelevant. The pitying glances at the grocery store and the hushed whispers at the country club were just background noise to a war they did not even know was happening. On Friday afternoon, my phone illuminated on the kitchen counter. A text message notification. It was from Victoria. I opened the message. The tone was brisk, stripped of her usual artificial warmth. "Ava," it read, "it is imperative you attend dinner tomorrow evening. We have family matters to discuss. Please be prompt." She was setting her stage. She wanted her audience in place. She anticipated a swift, brutal execution of my role in Julian's life. She expected Julian to hand over the signed contract, cementing her victory and securing the Sterling family bailout. She assumed I would arrive defenseless, ready to be discarded. I looked at the message. I thought about the 40-page dossier sitting securely in Thorne's vault. I thought about the buyout agreement that would reduce Richard's tyranny to ash. I typed a single word in response. Understood. I locked the screen and walked into my bedroom to select my dress for Saturday. The waiting was over. The executioner had built her scaffold, unaware she was weaving her own noose. The sun rose over the Pacific Ocean, casting a pale, indifferent light across our bedroom. It was Saturday morning. The air inside the house possessed a brittle quality, similar to the atmospheric drop just before a lightning strike. We did not speak much that morning. There was nothing left to debate. The strategy was codified in a thick manila envelope, currently resting on the kitchen island. It was the twin to the portfolio Richard had weaponized against his son, but our version contained a lethal payload. The previous 48 hours had been a masterclass in forensic litigation. Marcus Thorne did not merely draft a buyout agreement, he engineered a corporate guillotine. The standard separation clauses were insufficient for the magnitude of Richard's crimes. I sat in Thorne's Los Angeles office and detailed the specific legal mechanism I had utilized years prior to dismantle the fraudulent tech executive in Silicon Valley. It was an archaic, rarely invoked subsection of corporate law dealing with gross fiduciary negligence and extortion. I recited the statutory language from memory. I explained how the provision pierces the corporate veil when a majority shareholder utilizes company funds to service undisclosed personal debt while simultaneously coercing a subordinate officer. Thorne leaned back in his leather chair, a predatory gleam illuminating his eyes. He recognized the utility of the weapon I handed him. By weaving this specific clause into the fabric of the buyout agreement, we stripped Richard of all standard executive protections. It meant Richard could not hide behind the limited liability of Preston Development. The clause held him personally, criminally responsible for the restitution of the embezzled $12 million. Thorne's legal framework created a binary reality. Richard had two options. He could sign the equity transfer, relinquishing his 51% voting share and walking away from the empire he built, or he could refuse, facing immediate personal bankruptcy, followed by a federal indictment for wire fraud. There was no middle ground. There was no room for negotiation. While Thorne finalized the binding document, the social theater in Montecito reached its crescendo. Victoria had sent her text message the prior afternoon. I stared at the screen, analyzing her choice of words. "It is imperative you attend tonight. We have family matters to discuss." She assumed the text was a summons to the executioner's block. She wanted me present to witness my own erasure. She needed the audience. She required the physical presence of her victim to validate her triumph. I had typed back a single word: understood. Victoria likely read that reply as submission, a defeated woman bowing to the inevitable. She failed to comprehend the fundamental difference between social power and structural leverage. She had spent her week arranging place settings, polishing the heirloom silver, and coordinating the menu for her theatrical performance. We had spent our week weaponizing federal tax statutes. She was bringing a seating chart to a corporate siege. I watched Julian prepare for the evening. He stood before the full-length mirror in our bedroom, adjusting the cuffs of his charcoal suit. His movements were precise, devoid of the weary hesitation that had plagued him for months. He reached toward the dresser and picked up the dark blue velvet box. He extracted the Patek Philippe wristwatch, the bribe. He fastened the heavy gold band around his wrist. He secured the clasp, deliberately turning the instrument of his intended subjugation into a prop for his deception. He was going to walk into his childhood home wearing his father's leash, using their own arrogance as his camouflage. The man who used to swallow his pride to protect his construction crews was gone. The compliant pragmatist had evolved into a silent predator. He picked up his keys. He looked at me. His expression hardened into cold resolve. He was ready to unseat his father. I wore a simple navy sheath dress, minimal jewelry. My armor consisted entirely of the knowledge stored inside the manila envelope resting in my hands. The drive up the coast was muted. The landscape of Southern California blurred past the windows, a picturesque backdrop to a grim destination. We navigated the winding, manicured roads of the hills. Every sprawling mansion we passed represented a lineage built on ruthless acquisitions. We were about to perform one of our own. We passed the iron gates of the country club where Richard and Elise's father had undoubtedly sealed their corrupt pact over expensive scotch. They had brokered a fraudulent merger based on inflated equity, assuming Julian would simply function as the compliant signatory. They underestimated the son, and they entirely discounted the wife. The Preston estate loomed ahead. The imposing colonial structure sat at the crest of the hill, its white columns glowing under the exterior floodlights. The circular driveway was already populated with luxury vehicles. I recognized Nate's sports car parked near the entrance. Richard's heavy sedan sat in its designated spot, and a sleek imported coupe that undoubtedly belonged to Elise Sterling occupied the guest space. The players had assembled. The stage was set. Julian parked the car. He turned off the engine. The sudden quiet of the cabin was profound. He reached across the center console and rested his hand over mine. His grip was firm, a silent reaffirmation of the pact we forged in our kitchen the night I opened the Shadow Ledger. We stepped out of the vehicle. The evening air carried the scent of night-blooming jasmine and ocean salt. The gravel crunched under my heels as we walked toward the entrance. Faint, muffled laughter spilled from the dining room windows. I recognized the sharp braying sound immediately. Elise was already inside, entertaining the gallery, occupying the space she believed she had secured. The heavy mahogany front doors stood closed, guarding the orchestrated reality within. I held the dossier close to my side. I did not feel fear. The anxious dread that had haunted me for 14 months had evaporated, replaced by the icy clarity of a confirmed audit. Julian reached out and turned the brass handle. We stepped over the threshold, crossing from the quiet California night into the epicenter of the lie. The foyer was immaculate, smelling of expensive floor wax and fresh-cut lilies. The murmur of conversation drifted down the hallway, beckoning us toward the dining room. The moment of anticipation had crested. The executioner was waiting at the head of the table, unaware that the blade was poised directly over her own neck. We walked down the corridor, ready to take our seats at a table designed for our destruction. The corridor opened into the formal dining room. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm amber glow over the long oak table. Victoria had spared no expense for her victory lap. The family heirloom silver caught the light, arranged with geometrical precision next to bone china plates. A towering floral centerpiece of white orchids and pale hydrangeas dominated the center of the wood, obstructing the sightlines just enough to divide the space into distinct territories. The scent of roasted rosemary and red wine reduction filled the air, a heavy, rich aroma designed to signify permanence. I stood in the archway and surveyed the battlefield. Richard occupied the head of the table, his broad shoulders expanding against his tailored suit, nursing a tumbler of dark amber scotch. Nate and his wife murmured to each other on the left flank, their posture relaxed, oblivious to the structural rot beneath their feet. And there, positioned in the seat of honor, directly to the right of Julian's customary chair, sat Elise Sterling. She wore a silk emerald dress that draped effortlessly over her frame. Her hand rested delicately on the stem of her wineglass. She looked up as we entered, offering a greeting that possessed all the warmth of a frosted window pane. Elise was playing the role of the incoming monarch, surveying a kingdom she believed she had just inherited. Victoria glided out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a pristine linen cloth. Her eyes flicked toward Julian, noting the heavy gold watch circling his wrist. A flicker of deep satisfaction registered on her features. She believed the bribe had functioned perfectly. She believed she had purchased her son. "Julian, darling," Victoria purred, gesturing toward the empty chair beside Elise. "Take your seat. The roast is nearly ready." Then she turned her gaze to me. The artificial sweetness vanished, replaced by a cool administrative detachment. "Ava, we have placed you at the far end tonight. It balances the table better for the caterers." The far end was a small, isolated chair positioned near the swinging kitchen doors. It was a physical manifestation of a demotion, a visual representation of a wife being transitioned into a spectator. Elise let out a soft, breathy chuckle, masking it quickly with a sip of her wine. Nate shifted uncomfortably, inspecting his silverware. They all braced for my reaction. They expected me to argue about the seating chart. They anticipated the brittle, wounded pride of a woman being publicly replaced. I gave them nothing. I did not glare at Elise. I did not question Victoria. I walked the length of the long oak table, my heels clicking a steady rhythm against the hardwood, and pulled out the isolated chair. I sat down. I smoothed my navy dress over my knees. I placed the thick manila envelope face down on the wood beside my plate. I folded my hands in my lap, aligned my spine perfectly straight, and remained silent. My stillness unsettled the air. When you refuse to participate in a manufactured drama, the directors of that drama are forced to carry the weight of the awkwardness themselves. The room filled with a sudden, cloying discomfort. Julian took his designated seat next to Elise. He did not look in my direction. He pulled his chair in, rested his arms on the table, and allowed the Patek Philippe to catch the chandelier light. Dinner commenced with a rigid, orchestrated cadence. The caterers moved like ghosts, serving plated courses while Victoria directed the conversation. She treated the dining room like a corporate boardroom, delivering a keynote address, disguised as maternal chatter. We are just thrilled about the new direction the company is taking. Victoria announced, raising her glass toward Richard. And Elise, your father has been instrumental. Richard was telling me just yesterday how rare it is to find someone with Sterling's immaculate business acumen. The irony in the room was thick enough to carve. Victoria sat at the head of a table funded by stolen capital, bragging about a man whose financial ledger was bleeding out across international borders. She praised Elise's father for his brilliance, entirely ignorant of the fact that his European commercial real estate portfolio was operating at a catastrophic deficit. She applauded the very insolvency that was dragging her own husband toward a federal indictment. I thought about the Cayman Islands post office boxes. I thought about the Phantom Landscaping conglomerate. Victoria was cheering for a synchronized drowning, convinced it was a synchronized swimming routine. I took a deliberate, measured bite of my salad. I chewed slowly, savoring the layered reality of the moment. It is a profound experience to sit across from your executioner and realize they are boasting about the sharpness of their own guillotine. Elise preened under the praise. She touched her collarbone, feigning modesty. Daddy has always believed in strategic alliances, Elise murmured, offering a conspiratorial smile to Richard. He sees incredible potential in Preston development. He thinks combining our resources will secure a legacy for decades. A strategic alliance. I looked at Elise, this 29-year-old art history major, attempting to play the role of a corporate savior. She had no idea she was the designated bagman for a laundering scheme. Or perhaps she did know, and her desperation to maintain her cashmere lifestyle outweighed her moral compass. Either way, she was tying herself to a sinking ship, convinced she was boarding a luxury cruise. Nate chimed in, eager to validate his mother's script. It just makes sense, Nate said, gesturing with his fork. The market is shifting. We need partners who understand our landscape, people who speak our language. Nate relied entirely on this family trust fund. He had never balanced a checkbook in his life. Yet here he was, co-signing a multi-million-dollar fraud because it sounded exclusive. I kept my eyes fixed on the center floral arrangement. I did not offer a rebuttal to Nate's parroted talking points. My silence transformed from a passive state into an active, radiating force. Without a target to bounce their cruelty against, their words echoed hollowly in the large room. Victoria's bright, brittle tone began to sound strained. She kept glancing down the table at me, searching for a crack in my composure. She wanted to see a trembling lip or a white-knuckled grip on my water glass. She found only a quiet, impenetrable facade. I am an auditor. I have sat in countless boardrooms, across from executives sweating through their tailored suits while I reviewed their fraudulent tax returns. I know how to occupy a space without filling it with unnecessary noise. I know how to let guilty people fill the silence with their own anxiety. Richard cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the room's frequency. He turned to Julian, his voice laced with heavy expectation. I trust you had time to review the documents I provided on Tuesday, Richard said. The restructuring contract, the ransom note. Julian set his wineglass on the table. The gold watch gleamed. I read every page. Dad, Julian replied smoothly. His tone was frictionless, a perfect replication of the obedient son. The terms are very clear. The shift in capital authorization is a significant pivot. Richard nodded, a predatory satisfaction settling over his features. It is a necessary evolution. For the health of the entire enterprise, we need everyone pulling in the same direction. Richard shot a pointed, derogatory look down the length of the table toward my isolated chair. No distractions, no liabilities. They were discussing my termination in plain English, relying on my continued silence as proof of my defeat. Elise leaned closer to Julian, her shoulder brushing his dark suit jacket. "It is going to be so exciting to collaborate," she whispered, ensuring the entire table heard her. I placed my knife and fork side by side on my empty plate. The caterers stepped out from the kitchen, clearing the main course, preparing the stage for the final act. The porcelain vanished, leaving the polished oak surface bare. Victoria signaled the staff to hold the dessert service. She smoothed her silk blouse and stood up. The ambient chatter ceased. The trap was fully constructed, the audience was seated, and the director was stepping into the spotlight to deliver the final monologue. I rested my hand on top of the manila envelope. The paper was cool beneath my fingertips. The waiting was over. The silver spoon struck the crystal champagne flute. One sharp, clean note severed the remaining murmurs in the dining room. The echo hung in the air for a fraction of a second before fading into the heavy oak paneling. Victoria Preston stood at the head of the long table, radiating the practiced grace of a woman who had spent her entire adult life curating other people's destruction. She wore an ivory silk blouse and a smile that did not extend past her jawline. She walked slowly behind Elise Sterling, resting her manicured hands on the back of the emerald silk chair. "Family," Victoria began. Her voice dripped with an artificial sorrow that felt rehearsed in front of a vanity mirror. "We all know the last few years have been a transition. Growth is rarely without its growing pains." She patted Elise's shoulder. "But the Preston legacy requires partners who are built for this world, partners who understand the distinct weight of our responsibilities. Elise has graciously agreed to step in as Julian's partner in the new firm structure." The word partner was chosen with surgical precision. It blurred the line between corporate strategy and marital replacement. Elise offered a modest tilt of her head, accepting the coronation. She swirled her Pinot Noir, her posture radiating an unearned, practiced triumph. Richard did not bother with the velvet glove. He leaned forward, his elbows resting on the polished wood. The structure of his chair groaned under the shifting weight. He fixed his gaze on the isolated chair at the far end of the room where I sat. "Ava," he said, treating my name like a clerical error. "Julian is signing the restructuring papers tonight. You are excluded from this deal. Victoria has already had the housekeeper pack your coats. We expect you to leave quietly tonight without a scene. In exchange for your cooperation, we have arranged a modest severance for your time in our family. A severance package. For a marriage." He spoke the terms of my eviction with the casual authority of a man dismissing a junior analyst. In Richard's worldview, human beings were depreciating assets. When an asset stopped generating favorable returns, you wrote it off. You offered a payout to mitigate legal exposure, and you changed the locks. He assumed my working-class background made me susceptible to a quick buyout. He calculated that a girl from a Fresno diner would take the check and run rather than face the crushing weight of the Preston legal apparatus. The remaining guests held their breath. Nate Julian's brother stared intently at his water glass. He was unwilling to witness the execution, but perfectly happy to attend the feast. Elise offered me a thin, pitying smirk, her eyes bright with the thrill of victory. They all braced for the fracture. They expected tears. They anticipated a shouted defense, a thrown napkin, a desperate plea directed at my husband. They wanted the chaotic reaction that would validate the narrative they had spent months constructing. If I screamed, I was the unhinged woman Victoria claimed I was. If I cried, I was the weak outsider Richard believed me to be. They needed my hysterics to justify their cruelty. They needed me to perform the role of the unstable interloper so they could feel righteous in their theft. I gave them nothing. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend the sanctity of my marriage. I drew upon the training I use when a fraudulent chief financial officer tries to intimidate me during an audit. You do not match their energy. You remove the oxygen from the room. I looked at Victoria. I shifted my gaze to Richard, and I let the silence stretch. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. The silence transformed from an absence of noise into a physical entity. It grew heavy, pressing against the walls of the dining room. 4 seconds. 5 seconds. The caterers hovering near the swinging kitchen doors froze in place, unwilling to step into the crossfire. 6 seconds. 7. The louder their actions spoke, the quieter I became. My stillness stripped away the polished veneer of the evening. Without my anger to act as a shield, their behavior stood naked under the chandelier light. They were just rich bullies trying to buy their way out of a corner, and my refusal to play along was forcing them to sit in their own mess. 8 seconds. 9 seconds. 10 agonizing seconds. Richard shifted his weight again. The discomfort was beginning to burn through his arrogance. His face reddened slightly above his collar. He opened his mouth to repeat his demand, assuming I had simply failed to comprehend the directive or was too stunned to process the eviction. I spoke before he could form the syllable. "I am not leaving, Richard," I said. My voice was flat, devoid of any emotional tremor. It was the tone of someone stating a verified sum on a balance sheet. It carried no anger, no sorrow, and zero room for negotiation. The words disrupted the choreographed flow of the evening. Victoria's smile faltered, a slight involuntary twitch near the corner of her mouth. Elise blinked her smug expression, stalling halfway across her face. They had prepared for resistance. They had prepared for frantic, desperate resistance. They did not know how to process a calm, factual refusal. They did not understand how a woman with packed bags and a severance offer could sit in an isolated chair and dictate terms. I kept my hands folded over the thick manila envelope resting on the table beside my plate. I maintained direct eye contact with my father-in-law. "And I do not think Julian is signing your contract," I added. The secondary statement landed like a stone in a glass house. The confident smirks vanished. The air in the room grew brittle and sharp. Richard's face darkened into a dangerous shade of crimson. The veins in his neck became visible. He was a man who demanded obedience from everyone in his orbit, and he was currently receiving blunt insubordination from the one person he deemed least valuable. "What did you just say to me?" Richard growled, his voice dropping an octave into a menacing rumble. I did not repeat myself. Repeating yourself implies the other person controls the pace of the conversation. I kept my posture aligned and my breathing slow. I let my statement hang in the space over the white orchids and pale hydrangeas. Victoria turned her head sharply toward Julian. The script had deviated from her meticulous planning. The scene was failing. She needed the leading man to step in and restore order. She needed her son to silence the disruptive element and execute the transition. She looked at Julian, waiting for him to command me to leave. She waited for him to play the loyal, bought-and-paid-for heir who prioritized his inheritance over his wife. She waited for the heavy gold watch on his wrist to function as the leash they designed it to be. Julian, Victoria said, her tone laced with urgent expectation. "Tell her she needs to go. Now." The spotlight shifted from the far end of the table to the center. Nate watched his older brother, eager to see how a true Preston handled a domestic disturbance. Elise leaned slightly toward Julian, ready to console him the moment he finalized my termination. Julian sat perfectly still. The Patek Philippe gleamed under the amber light. He did not look at his mother. He did not look at his father. He looked down the length of the long oak table, directly at me. We held each other's gaze. A silent communication passed between us, a shared acknowledgement of the 14 months of quiet endurance, the late nights parsing encrypted data, and the legal trap waiting inside the envelope under my hand. The social skirmish was officially over. The corporate execution was about to commence. Julian did not raise his voice. He did not offer a soaring theatrical speech about the sanctity of marriage or the burden of his enduring loyalty. He simply severed the invisible strings that had controlled his movements for his entire adult life. He broke eye contact with me and turned his attention to the head of the table. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored charcoal jacket. He produced a thick manila envelope. It was the exact physical twin to the dossier resting under my hands at the far end of the room. He placed it flat on the polished oak surface. He placed his fingertips on the edge of the heavy paper and pushed. The envelope glided down the center of the long dining table. It passed the crystal salt cellars. It bypassed the towering arrangement of white orchids and pale hydrangeas. It traveled with a smooth, uninterrupted momentum until it stopped perfectly square in front of his father's dinner plate. "Ava is right, Dad," Julian said. His tone was smooth, frictionless, and devoid of the customary deference he had always deployed to manage his father's temper. "I am not signing your contract. You are signing mine." The declaration hung in the amber light of the chandeliers. Richard stared at the envelope. A scoff erupted from his chest, a harsh, guttural sound of pure dismissal. It was the scoff of a monarch encountering a peasant holding a wooden sword. He viewed Julian as a rebellious subordinate staging a clumsy mutiny. He assumed the envelope contained a resignation letter, a plea for better severance terms, or perhaps a toothless counteroffer drafted by a strip mall attorney. "What is this nonsense?" Julian Richard sneered. He did not look at the document. He kept his furious gaze locked on his son. "We do not negotiate terms at the dinner table. You will sign the restructuring agreement I provided, or you will find yourself locked out of the Wilshire site before you finish your coffee tomorrow morning." "Read the file," Dad Julian replied. He picked up his water glass and took a slow, measured sip. "I strongly advise you to read it before you make any further threats regarding my division." Victoria shifted in her chair. The deviation from her script was causing her visible distress. She looked at the envelope like it was a foul-smelling pestilence resting near her expensive china. She parted her lips to interject to reprimand Julian for ruining her orchestrated evening, but the gravity in her son's voice gave her pause. She looked at Richard, waiting for the patriarch to swat the nuisance away. Elise Sterling adjusted her posture. The smug, triumphant smile she had worn since dessert began to thin. She possessed enough predatory instinct to recognize when the power dynamic in a room was shifting. She glanced at the manila envelope and then at Julian, her eyes narrowing as she tried to calculate the risk. Richard snatched the envelope from the table. His movements were sharp, irritated. He tore the flap open and extracted the thick stack of documents. I sat at the isolated chair near the kitchen doors and watched the execution unfold. I knew every word printed on those pages. I knew the exact layout of the text. I watched Richard's eyes drop to the first page. The top sheet was the cover letter drafted by Marcus Thorne. I knew Richard would recognize the letterhead immediately. Every commercial developer operating on the West Coast knew Thorne's name. Thorne was a corporate grim reaper. He did not draft empty threats. He drafted obituaries for corrupt empires. I watched the initial flicker of recognition hit Richard's eyes. The irritation vanished, replaced by a sudden, sharp wariness. He flipped past the cover letter to the summary of findings. He was now looking at the 40-page forensic audit. I observed his eyes scanning the first paragraph. I knew he was reading the summary of the expedited vendor payments. I knew he was seeing the names of his dummy corporations printed in stark black ink. The Nevada consulting firm, the Delaware steel importer, the Cayman Islands landscaping conglomerate. Richard turned the page. The paper rattled slightly in his grip. He was looking at the color-coded spreadsheets now. He was seeing the green tabs denoting Julian's legitimate revenue and the red tabs marking the stolen capital. He reached the blue section, the network handshake protocols, the MAC addresses, the undeniable digital proof that the fraudulent wire transfers had originated from his own secure terminal in the penthouse suite of Preston Development. I watched the physiology of an arrogant man breaking down in real time. The flush of angry crimson that had colored his face only moments ago began to drain away. It retreated from his cheeks, leaving behind a sickly, pallid gray. The formidable broad shoulders that usually expanded to intimidate everyone in the room seemed to hollow out. The booming patriarch was shrinking inside his expensive tailored suit. He turned another page. He had reached the legal demands. He was reading the specific clauses Thorne had constructed using my auditing framework. I watched his eyes track over the words, wire fraud. I watched his gaze snag on the term embezzlement. I watched the realization sink into his bones as he read the phrase federal indictment. He realized he could not hide behind the corporate veil. He read the archaic clause regarding fiduciary negligence. He understood that the document held him personally and criminally liable for the restitution of $12 million. He understood that the ransom note he had tried to force upon Julian, the restructuring contract, had just been transformed into the primary evidence of his extortion. The silence in the dining room became suffocating. Nobody spoke. Nate watched his father with growing alarm. Victoria gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white, her eyes darting frantically between the documents and her husband's ashen face. Richard did not look up. He could not lift his eyes from the trap he had walked blindly into. He reached for his wineglass with his left hand. It was a reflexive motion, a desperate attempt to perform a normal action while his entire reality disintegrated. He wrapped his fingers around the stem of the crystal flute, but his hand would not obey him. The adrenaline and the sudden, catastrophic terror misfired through his nervous system. A deep, uncontrolled tremor started in his knuckles. The vibration traveled up his wrist, shaking the expensive fabric of his sleeve. He tried to lift the glass to his mouth. The dark red liquid sloshed violently against the crystal rim. The tremor intensified. It was not a subtle shake. It was a profound physical failure. The man who dictated the weather in Montecito could no longer dictate the muscles in his own hand. The crystal stem slipped through his failing grip. The glass fell. It struck the edge of the heavy oak table, first tipping outward, and plummeted toward the floor. It hit the polished hardwood with a deafening crash. The sharp, shattering sound fractured the suffocating silence of the room. Shards of expensive crystal exploded across the Persian rug. The dark red wine splashed across the polished wood, pooling like fresh blood at the feet of the patriarch. When the glass shattered, the illusion of the Preston Empire shattered with it. It was the auditory symbol of a dynasty collapsing under the weight of its own rot. The 51% controlling stake, the country club memberships, the generational wealth, the entire unearned kingdom, fractured into 1,000 useless pieces on the dining room floor. Richard stared down at the broken glass. His chest heaved with shallow, erratic breaths. He was a king without a crown, sitting at the head of a table he no longer owned. Julian sat beside the ruin, his posture relaxed, the gold Patek Philippe watch catching the amber light of the chandelier. He looked at the shattered crystal and then looked back at his father. The transition of power was complete. The dark red wine soaked into the Persian rug, spreading like a fresh bruise across the intricate woven pattern. Nobody moved to clean it up. The shattered crystal lay scattered across the polished hardwood, catching the chandelier light in sharp, jagged reflections. The destruction on the floor mirrored the sudden, catastrophic fracture of the power dynamic in the room. Julian looked at the ruin at his father's feet, then raised his eyes to meet Richard's pale, sunken face. "You stole $12 million from my division," Dad Julian said into the dead silence. His voice carried no malice, only the weight of a finalized ledger. "You forged my digital signature. You routed the capital through shell companies in the Cayman Islands to service your toxic mezzanine debt. You attempted to frame me for a federal crime to insulate yourself." Richard opened his mouth. His jaw worked, but the booming baritone that had commanded boardrooms for 3 decades was gone. He produced a thin, reedy sound, a half-formed syllable of denial that died before it reached his lips. He looked down at the 40-page forensic audit. The evidence was insurmountable. The paper trail was closed. "Sign over your 51% controlling stake tonight," Julian continued, tapping his index finger once against the oak table. "Relinquish all executive authority over Preston Development immediately. In exchange, Ava and I will walk away, and you can attempt to liquidate what remains of your personal portfolio to avoid foreclosure. If you refuse, or if you hesitate, Ava's audit goes to the Federal Bureau of Investigation tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock. A choice between poverty and prison, a binary reality with no loopholes. Victoria Preston stared at the man she had married. The polished matriarch, the woman who had orchestrated my social execution with meticulous precision, was trying to process the sudden devaluation of her entire existence. Her eyes darted from the spilled wine to the manila envelope and finally to Julian. "Julian, this is absurd," Victoria gasped. Her tone was frantic, stripped of its usual curated elegance. "Your father would never do this. You are making a terrible mistake. Ava has manipulated these numbers to tear us apart. The numbers do not possess an agenda, Mom," Julian replied. "They just count the theft." Victoria turned to Richard, demanding he refute the accusation. Tell him she insisted her pitch, climbing higher, scraping against the walls of the dining room. Tell your son this is a fabrication. Tell him to throw that garbage away. Richard did not look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on the spilled wine. His silence was the loudest confession in the room. The reality fractured Victoria's composure. The woman who never raised her voice beyond a measured purr let out a visceral, piercing shriek. It was an ugly, unrefined sound. The facade dissolved, leaving behind a panicked, desperate woman watching her country club memberships, her charity galas, and her pristine social standing evaporate into thin air. She turned her fury on Richard. She pounded her fists against the edge of the dining table, ignoring the rattling silver. She demanded to know how he could be so reckless. She interrogated him about the offshore accounts, her voice echoing harshly off the mahogany panels. She was unraveling, tearing her own kingdom apart in front of the very audience she had invited to witness my demise. She was no longer the director of the play. She was the casualty of a tragedy she had helped produce. Elise Sterling possessed the survival instincts of a mercenary. She recognized that the Preston Empire was a mirage. The infusion of cash her father desperately needed to save their own over-leveraged European assets was gone. She was tethering herself to a sinking ship commanded by a man facing imminent federal indictment. She stood up abruptly. The legs of her chair scraped harshly against the floor. She did not offer a comforting word to Victoria. She did not cast a sympathetic glance toward Richard. She grabbed her designer clutch purse from the table and turned toward the hallway, eager to escape the blast radius. "Leaving so soon?" Elise Julian asked. Elise froze mid-step. She glanced over her shoulder, her expression a mix of haughty disdain and raw panic. "This is a private family dispute," she stated, her vocal cords tight. "I am not involving myself in your domestic dysfunction." "It ceased being a domestic dispute the moment your father agreed to launder the embezzled funds through your London art gallery," Julian said. Elise turned around fully. Her manicured hands gripped her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You have no idea what you are talking about. My gallery is a legitimate enterprise." "Your gallery is a clearinghouse for fraudulent equity," I interjected, speaking for the first time since the glass broke. My voice was even cutting through Victoria's ongoing hysterics. "We traced the Cayman Island holding companies. We mapped the buyers. We possess the routing numbers linking your international sales directly to Richard's dummy corporations." Julian stood up from his chair. He buttoned his suit jacket, transforming from a son into a corporate executioner. "Our attorney contacted the regulatory authorities regarding the Sterling Investment Group yesterday afternoon," Julian informed her. "Marcus Thorne filed an injunction to freeze your father's strategic partner accounts, pending an investigation into international money laundering. The assets are locked. The capital is gone." Elise stared at him, her mouth parted in silent horror. The smug, practiced triumph she had worn all evening vanished. She had arrived at the Preston estate expecting to inherit a real estate dynasty and banish the working-class wife. She was leaving not just without a husband, but entirely bankrupt. Her family's wealth, her cashmere lifestyle, her carefully guarded pedigree were all currently sitting in a frozen account under federal review. She turned and fled. The sharp, frantic clicking of her heels echoed down the hallway, followed by the heavy thud of the front door slamming shut. She ran out into the California night, stripped of her arrogance, chasing the ghost of a fortune she would never recover. Nate sat frozen on the left flank of the table. His wife held a napkin over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Nate had parroted his mother's talking points for months. He had suggested Elise was a better fit for the Preston name. He had advised Julian to let me step away. Now he was staring at the wreckage of his inheritance, realizing that the trust fund he relied upon to fund his Tuesday golf games had been secretly drained to cover his father's toxic debt. He possessed no skills, no leverage, and no future within the company. He was merely collateral damage. I stood up from my isolated chair at the far end of the room. I did not rush. I smoothed the fabric of my navy dress. I picked up my clutch purse. Julian walked around the length of the long oak table. He did not look at his mother, who had collapsed into her chair, weeping openly into her hands. He did not look at his father, who remained paralyzed, staring at the ruined contract. Julian walked directly to me. He extended his hand. I placed my hand in his. His grip was warm and steady. We did not offer a parting speech. We did not hurl insults or demand apologies. An apology from people who only value leverage is entirely worthless. Storming out is a tactic reserved for people who have not already won. We had secured the victory before we ever crossed the threshold. We turned our backs on the dining room. We walked down the corridor, leaving the chaos behind us. We passed the framed family tree hanging in the living room, the meticulous chart of the original bloodline. It looked small now, a fragile piece of paper pretending to be a fortress. Julian opened the heavy mahogany front doors. We stepped out into the night. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of ocean salt and eucalyptus. The contrast between the suffocating, heavy atmosphere of the dining room and the expansive darkness outside was profound. The gravel crunched under our feet as we walked toward the car. We had entered the estate as targets of a coordinated social execution. We walked out, holding the keys to the empire. We had drawn our boundaries with a forensic audit and enforced them with a corporate buyout. I looked at the man walking beside me. He had shed the weight of a corrupted legacy. He had chosen the girl from the Fresno diner over the illusions of Montecito. He had recognized that true partnership does not require a pedigree. It requires the courage to dismantle a bomb while standing on the pressure plate. We got into the car. Julian started the engine. The headlights illuminated the manicured driveway. We drove away from the colonial mansion on the hill, our assets secured, our marriage forged in fire, and our dignity intact. We left them sitting in the dining room, surrounded by cold food and shattered crystal, drowning in the ruins of the empire we had just taken from them. The sound of shattering crystal against a hardwood floor is not just the noise of a broken glass. Sometimes it is the sound of an entire generational legacy collapsing under the weight of its own rot. When Julian and I walked out of that sprawling Montecito estate, leaving his parents sitting in the ruins of a fraudulent empire, the cool California night air felt like a baptism. But the true victory that evening was not merely a corporate checkmate or a successful forensic audit. It was the culmination of two vastly different approaches to parenting family responsibility and the values we instill in our children. In American culture, the concept of the traditional family is often idealized as a fortress of unwavering loyalty and shared prosperity. But loyalty without emotional awareness is just a hostage situation dressed up as a family business. Richard and Victoria Preston believed they were raising heirs to a formidable commercial real estate empire. They provided their sons with every material advantage: prestigious charity galas, tailored suits, and a stratosphere of generational wealth. Yet their parenting was morally bankrupt. They did not teach Julian and his brother Nate how to navigate the world with fairness or honesty. Instead, they taught them that love was a transaction and obedience was a commodity to be purchased. Richard, a booming man who used his 51% controlling stake as a leash, viewed his children not as human beings, but as depreciating assets to be managed. He attempted to buy Julian's compliance with a Patek Philippe wristwatch, a heavy gold band that served as a physical manifestation of his tyranny. Victoria, a master of the accidental omission, weaponized her social status, using polite cruelty and curated dinners to isolate anyone who did not fit her pristine bloodline. They raised Nate to be a golden boy who wore his unearned inheritance like a personality trait, a man who spent his Tuesdays on the golf course and parroted his mother's opinions without a single critical thought. When the empire finally imploded, Nate was left frozen in horror, realizing that the trust fund he relied upon had been secretly drained. He possessed no skills and no leverage because his parents had protected him from the reality of hard work. They had crippled him with privilege. Contrast this with a narrow, grease-stained diner off Highway 99 in Fresno. My mother worked 14-hour days managing everything from the grill to the supply orders as a single parent. She did not have trust funds or country club memberships to pass down to me. Instead, late at night, under a flickering fluorescent bulb, she sat at a back booth with a stack of invoices and a calculator. She taught me to track every ounce of flour and every gallon of milk. When a supplier tried to overcharge her, she spent hours tracking down the original purchase order to prove the discrepancy. My mother handed me the most valuable inheritance a child can receive in this country: the ability to see the truth. She looked at me with tired but sharp eyes and imparted a lesson meant to stick. Numbers are the only things that do not lie when rich men speak. She taught me that when people try to tell you a story about what you owe them, you show them the math, because the math never changes its story. That working-class grit, that deep-seated belief in self-reliance and honesty, was the armor I wore when I walked into the Preston family's crosshairs. My mother raised me to understand that nobody is coming to save you, and that you must build your life with your own hands. Because she fostered my emotional awareness and professional discipline, I became a senior corporate auditor capable of dismantling a $12 million embezzlement scheme from my kitchen island. I didn't need to scream or throw a wine glass when Victoria and Richard attempted to fire me from my own marriage and replace me with Elise Sterling, a desperate heiress. I just let my stillness strip away their polished veneer, relying on the quiet competence my mother instilled in me. Raising children with a strong moral compass means teaching them to identify the rot, even when it is hidden behind white columns and heirloom silver. Julian had to endure the agonizing realization that the father he respected was systematically destroying him to preserve his own liberty. Richard had cloned Julian's security tokens and spoofed his login credentials, framing his own flesh and blood for federal wire fraud, just to cover toxic mezzanine loans. A parent's ultimate betrayal is using their child as a shield for their own sins. But Julian's journey is a testament to the power of breaking generational curses. He did not succumb to the cowardice of a man waiting for the right moment to defect. Instead, he chose the girl from the Fresno diner over the illusions of Montecito. He stood at the head of that heavy oak table, slid a 40-page forensic audit toward his father, and calmly demanded the surrender of a corrupt empire. He chose his wife, demonstrating that true family responsibility is about protecting the home you build, not blindly defending the house you were born into. We walked out of that estate with our boundaries, our assets, and our dignity completely intact. We did not storm out, because storming out is a tactic reserved for people who have not already won. We left them drowning in the ruins of the empire we had just taken from them, surrounded by cold food and the consequences of their own arrogance. If you have ever sat across a table from people who treat your life like a business transaction you can cancel, or if you have had to untangle yourself from the golden leashes of a toxic family, you are not alone. Your dignity is not a negotiation. Welcome back to Pawn of Vengeance. If this story resonates with the quiet wars you have fought in your own life, drop your age in the comments and be sure to subscribe. In the end, the legacy we leave our children is never printed on bank statements or engraved on country club plaques. It is forged in the quiet moments when we teach them how to stand their ground. We raise them to be the kind of people who do not flinch when the room turns against them. But as you look at your own children, or the life you are building piece by piece, you have to ask yourself, are you handing them a compass to navigate the dark, or are you just handing them a heavier leash? The answer will eventually echo through the halls of your own house long after the glass has shattered.